Maskey report in relation to mental health. This is another such of these days when we talk about hip surgeries, unnecessary hip surgeries in Children's Health Ireland. The patients and families affected by the publication of the audit report are to the forefront of my mind, as they are for every deputy here. I understand the frustration and anxiety, indeed the anger that the families and these children and young people will be feeling as they read through the report and consider its findings. There's no doubt that parents out there will be questioning themselves, wondering if they did something wrong, questioning the trust they placed in the doctors to care properly for their children. Children's Health Ireland and the clinicians that work there, Lasky and Corla, they have a job of work to do to restore and build trust with children and their families. We can all have our say on all sides of the house. However, what matters most and is most important for me is that the families get answers to all the questions they have arising from the report. I know Minister Carl McNeill has directed a strong and urgent response to the report, with the children, parents and families at the centre of the response. Children's Health Ireland need to continue to respond now without equivocation, and I note the apology from the Chief Executive that families were not offered one consistent and excellent standard of care, that children were simply let down, and that Children's Health Ireland is acting swiftly to provide answers to patients and families. I think it's important to highlight that clinical follow-up is underway for children who have had these procedures. This has to be the immediate priority, and I welcome that these patients are front and centre. I do welcome that letters are issuing to families and that appropriate follow-up arrangements will be put in place, taking account of each individual case, the age of the child and where they had their surgery. We can't leave patients or their parents questioning something in a letter or unsure if the latest piece of information actually relates to them. And I was actually shocked to hear, even though I only heard it anecdotally across the Dáil today, that in the letters it requested that only one parent attend with a child. I think that is absolutely appalling, and I think we will have to rectify that. Parents must be facilitated in their communications currently underway with families in relation to the arrangements and next steps currently available to them. Their questions must be answered, and they must be able to trust and rely on the health services in place to treat children. It is crucial that families are updated, they're communicated with in a transparent and timely manner, and their worries, questions and feedback are listened to closely as the response to this issue rolls out. I know an important question that still remains for parents is whether the surgery their child had met the proper standard. That question must be answered for each and every person that asks it, and it must be answered by the clinicians and not us as politicians. I look forward to hearing further from the Board and Executive of Children's Health Ireland on implementation of the recommendations in an open and transparent way.
Minister Jennifer Carr-McNeill.
Thank you, Lasky and Corla, and I welcome this opportunity to update the House on the response already underway following the publication of the clinical audit into DDH surgery on children in CHI and Cappagh, published last Friday, 23rd of May. This follows on from our debate on the 29th of April, where we said that we would revisit this, and I think it's appropriate that we continue to work on these issues together over the coming months to address our shared concerns and to move to a place where we have better confidence in the clinical governance and clinical decision-making in certain parts of CHI that have presented repeated difficulties for patients. I know that parents and young people themselves will have many questions when they read the report and the findings of the report, and will lead to worry and uncertainty for them. And like many members of this House, I have met with and spoken with parents whose children had these surgeries, and I know their worry, as I know my colleagues in this House know their worry. That experience of worry for your child, of being completely in the hands of a clinician and their advice and their decisions, is one that those perhaps who have not experienced it perhaps cannot understand the depth of that concern. In that vein, can I say that I respond today and other days to all issues in CHI that we face together in this House, both as the current Minister for Health, but also as the parent of a child in the long-term care of CHI. I hope that the actions that I and we now take in help in that process, though I do recognise that the volume of cases mean that it will be some time before everyone has a resolution to their satisfaction, and I'm not happy about this, but please do let me take you through the actions to be taken and the backdrop against which they are taken, where I think we will need to go together in the future. The actions that I now take, I hope, will ensure better improvements. First, implementing the clinical recommendations of the audit to prioritise patients' follow-up care. Second, establishing an independent and external expert panel to lead a retrospective review of individual cases to determine the appropriateness of the original decision-making for performing the pelvic osteotomy. And third, taking steps to strengthen governance and oversight in CHI as we move to a longer-term perspective. My immediate priority is to ensure that there is clinical follow-up and care for patients who have gone this surgery. This follow-up will be in accordance with best practice and the recommendations of the report. I know deputies already know that there has been an information line available over the weekend. This is an information signposting for parents in the first instance over the weekend, and I totally appreciate that it does not answer every question, nor can it, and in that effort to provide signposting. But what parents do need and what they will receive is letters from CHI and Cappagh about the arrangements and next steps that individually apply to them and to their child, and how they will get further information and support. I expect these letters to be accurate, personalised, and while deputies I know appreciate that I do not personally sign off on the letters, can I assure you that I have said to both of these institutions that I expect that standard to be there in relation to these letters. Recognising that the wait for the letter is difficult in itself, and I don't want parents getting wrong information of any kind. I have been informed that clinical follow-up to skeletal maturity in CHI Crumlin is already underway for 447 patients, many of whom, about 200, are almost at skeletal maturity and will likely need just one more appointment. Clinical follow-up is also underway for CHI Temple Street and Cappagh patients. These children have been identified and categorised by age. That encompasses about 1,800 children. Again, a proportion here, 392 as I understand it, are close to skeletal maturity. It is planned that a multidisciplinary team, including physiotherapists, nurse specialists and overseen by a consultant surgeon who is appropriate, will be involved in this clinical review. It's also important to recognise this transition of care for patients who require follow-up by adult services, that be agreed, and a new model of care for all children who have gone these surgeries will be implemented, generally involving review at 5, 8, 12 years post-operation. Deputies are already aware that a cross-site pre-operative surgical meeting is already in place since March 2025. We discussed that at our discussion on this in April, so that all children being discussed are discussed at this meeting before being listed for surgery by any of the services concerned. This, along with contacting parents whose child may have been impacted by this audit, were, I am told, the two recommendations that the auditor made to CHI when he provided a draft of the report in March. I am told that CHI were informed that they were the only two recommendations were available and definitely would not change pending the publication of the report. But in respect of a retrospective review, what parents will want to know, of course, is whether the surgery that their child had was clinically indicated, was appropriately clinically indicated. Patients and parents are entitled to know that, and there will be retrospective review of their case to determine the indications for surgery. Was it needed, or how was it in line with standards at the time that it was indicated? This is separate to the clinical follow-up process. It is a separate and additional process involving a panel of independent external experts who will be established for this purpose, not connected to CHI, just to be very clear. That panel will be comprised of radiologists and paediatric orthopaedic surgeons and will be chaired by an international expert. Professor Deborah McNamara, President of RCSI, has agreed to assist the HSE in establishing this expert panel. Today I brought a memo to Government to set out the high-level terms of reference for this review. The review will have the following objectives: to provide individualised case reports for each of the cases affected, to provide an overall collated report, to provide expert opinion insofar as possible on individual cases of potential implications where it was identified that a procedure was not necessary. I'll ensure that deputies have this to hand. To have due regard for the criteria set out by Mr Thomas within his report and the criteria being developed by the expert reference group. To document the final suite of criteria against which the original surgery will be assessed. And in conducting the review, the experts will be cognizant of the historic nature of the work and aware of confirmation and hindsight bias. This terms of reference cannot be finalised until the review panel is some way in place, because I want to, of course, make sure that they are comfortable with the terms of reference, but I have taken it as far as I can take it, and I need the expert panel's opinion on their own terms of reference as well, as I imagine you will understand. Obviously, parental consent to participate in the review is required, though I suspect parents will be actively seeking this review rather than us asking them to consent to it. So this will take a little time. both to bring together the panel and, of course, then to complete the reviews. This is a recommendation of the report which we received on Thursday and published on Friday. I know the deputies in this House, across the House, have criticised this not already being in place, but as I said in April, I can only go on the detail of the report as it is presented to me. I did receive this report on Thursday last week at 4 p.m. It was published in full, as I said it would be, redacting any personal information, which, as it turned out, needed not to be necessary. It was published at 1 p.m. on Friday. The terms of reference and follow-up process is now agreed by Government, and the outstanding piece is the independent experts, and I assure the House that I will move with the same pace and urgency on that matter as I have, I hope, with other matters. In relation to governance, I want to be really clear about accountability and governance response issues. It is absolutely correct, as deputies in this House have already done, to look at the systemic and structural issues that we will all discuss shortly. But I also want to take a moment to recognise that we are having these series of debates because of the decision-making of individual consultant surgeons, whom the audits and the HICWA report have said, this audit have said we're not operating in line with international practice, and whose explanations for those operations were not accepted by the auditor. In the HICWA report, we were responding to a series of decisions that a surgeon made that led them to using non-surgical springs in the bodies of small children. We have to ensure clinical governance and accountability, but I do not want our focus on that to detract from the individual decision-making and the individual accountability that is appropriate for the individual surgeons making decisions about small children. Related to this, though, on the broader governance issue, I have said a number of times that I am trying to look at this question in relation to the broader governance of CHI in a way that enables the functional continuity of CHI, both to respond to the various patient needs, the issues that we are discussing, the broader running of the paediatric system, and to move us towards opening the new hospital. And I want to make sure that we see the appropriate governance structure in place to make sure that we have clinical leads who are managing each team, as I said back in April after the publication of the HICWA report. I want to make sure that every consultant who is employed in the Irish state knows that they are not a single fiefdom, that they work within a hospital system, that they are public servants, that they are paid by the taxpayer, and that they follow rules set out by us in an appropriate governance structure. I want a culture, again, as I've said before, where people who see that are things that are clearly wrong not only can step forward and say them, but must step forward and say them, and be afforded the appropriate protections. And in that vein, I particularly want to thank the whistleblower in this context who brought this information to light, and respect the work that whistleblowers have done in this case, as they have done in other cases. I am trying, deputies, and I hope that we will work together on this, I'm sure that we will. I'm trying to undertake a transformation process in a steady way, but I don't wish that to be interpreted as ignoring the importance of any of these issues. I'm trying to manage this in a steady way. CHI was established back in 2018 in the Act to bring together 3 historic hospitals under a single roof. And there were differences and cultural problems manifesting themselves in various different ways over the period, but I think the concept of a single paediatric system is now well settled, even if sometimes some people need a little reminding. The board is an unusual construct where 4 members, as I have said to you before, 4 members are appointed by the Minister, 8 are appointed by the board itself, coming from the nominations of the old historic entities that were brought together to CHI, and the board itself appoints the chair. There have been members of the board dating back to 2018, including until recently the chair, and then there are other members, many members who have been appointed in 2025, one in 2024, and so on. So there are 2 very different sets of institutional memory and institutional experience. Deputies will be aware that in the past weeks, in April, the chair stepped down, and since then a total of 4 other members have stepped down, all of whom I believe were appointed in 2018. This morning I referenced on radio, this afternoon I referenced on radio that 3 resignations I had received this morning, but I did not reference, and of course I should have, that a 4th had stood down last week, so my apologies for my oversight in that regard. It was certainly not intentional. But I do thank them for their contribution, and I do want to just take a moment to say that we have to think about public appointments and public service generally, that we are asking these board members generally, whether it's for CHI or other entities, they are people who we are asking to serve the public interest. They are not professional clinicians, but they are people who are broadly committed to public service. And I'm not saying that by many means of excusing individual actions or so on. I'm just simply saying that it is all of our interest that people continue to perform public service, and that's why I'm trying to separate out some of the issues from the decisions of individual clinicians. These things should not be conflated. But I think it is true, and I've said this in different ways before, that it was important in the case of CHI that while the experience of the board setting up in 2018 had very, very serious and difficult work to do, I do think it's now appropriate that their experience is brought to us to a point where a refresh is appropriate. And I take the next steps now with the following purpose. I have moved immediately to strengthen governance and oversight structures at CHI and Cappagh. That will be done by the appointment of 2 members of the Health Service Executive Board to the board of CHI. I have already done that. That was before I received these additional resignations, so I now have additional vacancies that I'll reflect on. In relation to Cappagh, I have asked this HSE CEO, Bernard Gloucester, to consider the implications of the audit for Cappagh and its oversight of paediatric surgery conducted at the hospital, and the CEO has agreed to do that and respond in the coming days. At operational level, there will be a strengthening of the service level agreement between CHI and HSE to strengthen operational oversight and increased involvement and support from the Dublin Midlands Regional Executive Officer and senior management, and that is designed to support the new CEO, Lucy Nugent, in CHI and enable her to continue with the transformation programme that she has already begun. Ms Nugent is in post just since February. She is in the process of establishing a new executive team around her to lead this new stage for CHI in the way I think that we want to see done. She reports to the board, and she needs a functional board to be able to function. So it is in nobody's interests to move things too rapidly. There does need to be a functional board, though it is clear I do want to see it move in a particular direction, and I think my appointments to date have signalled that direction. I have, as I've referenced before, for example, on April 9th in this House, the day after the publication of the HIPAA report, I have said that I am open to looking at the governance of CHI in the round. I've said that we need to have a functional system to be able to work towards the opening of the National Children's Hospital. And I said that I'm open to looking at everything in the round, but I said at that point I wanted to receive the other 2 reports first. It is now clear, some weeks later, that we have a very different board to the one that was there, certainly when I took office, and much more importantly, when these events occurred. Secondly, I have said very clearly that I want to see the appropriate clinical governance structure. So what that means is that consultants work to a clinical governance structure from whom they take direction, to whom they are accountable. Today I met with the Attorney-General about my next steps, both in relation to the board, in relation to clinical governance structures, and in relation to broader governance issues and how CHI interfaces with the HSE, recognising that the HSE of course funds CHI, and I will take a steady approach to this, and I welcome all perspectives from members of this House about the desirable income and the steps to get there while enabling the continued function of CHI. I do want to enable Minister O'Connor to speak as well, but it is very important as well that while we are discussing the hip dysplasia issue today, I do of course want to acknowledge to the House that I need to update you regarding an internal CHI report that was covered in the media on Sunday. The internal CHI report was provided by CHI to the HSE CEO on Monday the 26th of May, and I received a copy from the HSE yesterday, on Monday the 26th of May. Yesterday evening, I wrote to the board of CHI requesting a full response to the report. I wrote a detailed letter asking specific questions, and I reserve my right to write further letters. I do need to now receive this response, but on receipt of that response, my officials will follow up to address outstanding risks and concerns where they still exist. In addition, the HSE CEO is commissioning an audit of governance and equity in patient access and waiting list management at CHI. The audit aims to assess governance and equity in access to care, especially regarding the balance between public and private patient management. And I will consider further responses to these issues around waiting list management and the NTPF raised in the report, and I have asked the NTPF for their perspective as well. We are also mandating centralised referral to all CHI surgical services so that all GP referrals will be processed by a central system, enhancing transparency, equity and efficiency with the aim of ensuring patients are cared for based on clinical need and to increase effective management of waiting lists. I'm happy to take, I've tried to leave as much time so that I can take questions throughout, but we will, I know, speak about this again in the Oireachtas Committee, I hope, very shortly.
Minister Murnane O'Connor.
And thank you very much, Ministers. And I want to begin today by acknowledging the anxiety that many young patients and their families will be feeling this week as they read the report on the surgery for children with developmental dysplasia on the hip across CHI and the National Orthopaedic Hospitals and its findings. I can only imagine the distress and upset that families are experiencing, and there is clearly an urgent need to establish why so many children receive surgery when they didn't need it. There must be accountability. I would like to thank the expert auditor, Mr. Thomas, for his work on this report, as well as the recommendations he has advised. I note that the audit report and its recommendations have been accepted in full by CHI, Cappagh and the HSE, and the important work to implement these recommendations is already underway. I know that families still have many questions about their individual's child surgery and are seeking answers as to what the next steps will be for them following this audit. The first priority will be to recall all the children affected by the audit for a clinical review to see how they are doing now and to make sure they don't have any complications from the surgery. It is critical now that they get proper follow-up to the age of skeletal maturity, where their bones are fully grown and developed, which is typically between the ages of 12 to 16. Parents are due to receive personalised letters from the hospitals in the coming days about this follow-up. Processes have also begun in place since March of this year to ensure safeguarding. I understand that all DDH cases are being reviewed by a single team involving clinicians from all 3 sites before any decisions for surgery is made. Parents still have questions about whether their child's surgery met the proper standard, and the Minister is putting an expert panel in place to deal with this. Parents will be informed about the details of this process shortly. I am mindful that there are other relevant processes going on that are awaiting completion, the learning from which we will feed back into the future development of the services. It is important that there is fundamental reform at CHI to ensure that a multidisciplinary approach across all areas of medicine, which is a responsibility for patients and their families, must have trust and confidence in the care that they are receiving. And I just want to say from the other 2 ministers speaking there that the commitment is giving, that the work is ongoing, that I know the ministers are working with the departments in all the areas they need to work to get this sorted. And I want to thank you today for this. Thank you.
Deputy Cullinan.
Good morning. Minister, I think you would agree that the cornerstone of our health service is trust. So I'm not a clinician. I don't think you're a clinician. Most deputies in this House are not clinicians, some are. But we depend on clinicians to guide us. We depend on clinicians when we develop specialist services, for example. And we depend on clinicians when we get sick. And that came to a very sharp focus during COVID, for example, when there was people who tried to sow mistrust in relation to clinical advice. I was always of the view that if I get sick, I'll go to my GP, thank you very much, for medical advice. And we put our faith in the medical fraternity, and that's what we have to do. But when that breaks down, it is really, really difficult and really, really challenging. And it has to be said that trust is shattered in Children's Health Ireland, in particular in the orthopaedic services, unfortunately. And how could it be any different when you look at numerous reports now which have cited governance failures, management failures, clinical failures, ethical failures, conflicts of interest failures, open disclosure failures, and many more failures right across the system. And I think that obviously creates real problems now for Children's Health Ireland. And while you're a new minister, and you're obviously trying to respond to this in the best way that you can, I've no doubt about that. This isn't an issue that just dropped into our laps over the last number of weeks. In fact, I would imagine there are parents and there are advocate groups who are watching and listening to this debate who will be quite rightly saying, we also blew the whistle on many of these issues for many years, and they feel betrayed that they met with what they would describe as a wall of silence, a brick wall. I know you met some of those advocates and some of those parents in recent weeks as well. I've met them several times. because they were raising issues in relation to governance failures, clinical failures, management failures, ethical failures, and many more for years. I listened to them. I raised some of their concerns in this House, as did my party leader, as did others, including Deputy Murphy and others here as well. And unfortunately, they were not supported, or at least they would tell me very directly, and we have to be conscious of their experience, that they did not feel supported. So I just make the point, Minister, that these are not new issues. And unfortunately, they are varied. So very recently, we had a report from HICWA into the use of non-medical grade springs. That was, in its own right, a shocking report. It obviously pointed to very, very serious clinical failures by a clinician, obviously. That person has to take responsibility for their actions, in my opinion. But the report again also cited very clear process failures, management failures and so on in Children's Health Ireland, which had wider implications beyond the issues of the use of non-medical grade springs. But there was one line in the report which I've said to you a number of times, Minister, that was most damning, where it said that children were not protected from harm. And if that was the only issue in Children's Health Ireland, as bad as that was, if that was the only issue, well then we could deal with that. But unfortunately, that was not the case. We also have, as you know, a clinical review into, I'm not sure if it is one surgeon, but certainly Surgeon A, that was at the heart of the issues in relation to the use of non-medical grade springs. I know that person's clinical practice is under review by Dr. Nyagam, maybe others as well. I know that what Dr. Nyagam is looking at was, again, very unusual patterns of high rates of return to surgery, infections and other issues. We still haven't got that report. I have no doubt, and we obviously have to wait until the report is finished, but I have no doubt that report is going to point to very similar issues, very similar patterns in relation to failures. Clinical, yes, but also governance and management. And then we had the leaking of the audit into hip dysplasia and osteotomies carried out on children. That first arrived and was published, as we know, on the Ditch publication. Not, I have to say, picked up and covered all that much, even though it was being raised in this Dáil. Many of us saw it as a very serious issue. Of course, it was only a draft audit, but what was in the draft audit and what was then published was obviously really, really worrying. And then very quickly after that audit was leaked, and then that was, I can only assume, from a whistleblower that put that into the public domain. And you know, we all have commended whistleblowers in Children's Health Ireland who've come forward, and I've met some of them myself as well over the course of the last number of years. But very quickly after that audit was leaked and arrived and was on the Ditch publication, letters were then sent out to families, and as we know, 2,200 letters were sent. We have very worried parents, very anxious parents, very angry parents for a whole range of reasons and understandable reasons. They're very worried that an operation or a procedure could have been carried out on their child that was unnecessary, and that would be cruel when you consider all of the stories that I've heard of children who've had to learn to walk again after these procedures. Children put through surgeries that obviously are painful, obviously is difficult for any child. And I have I keep saying two children, one is 18, so he's now an adult, but I have a 14-year-old, and I can only imagine if any of our children had a procedure that we felt was not necessary or was unnecessary for whatever reason, we would be devastated. And that devastation is obviously real with those parents. And again, we don't know why. You know, parents are asking me, not just on this issue, but on all of these issues, how is that allowed to happen for so long? How is it that surgeons failed? Not all of them, because I do want to put on the record there are many, many brilliant surgeons in Children's Health Ireland, many brilliant staff, and I said this very publicly, my heart goes out to all of the great staff working in Children's Health Ireland to do such a fantastic job. But there are those who failed, and they have to take responsibility for that. But others failed as well, Minister. And when you talked about members of the board and wanting to be careful and wanting to be cautious, and that the new CEO is accountable to a board and so on, Parents get very frustrated when they hear that because they feel that at a corporate level, Children's Health Ireland has let them down and their children down. And I accept that and I can understand that. I welcome the fact that 4 board members have now stood down, as has the chair. I think other members of the board need to be stood down or stand down themselves and need to be replaced as quickly as possible if we are to have confidence. I saw some media reports, and I'm not sure how accurate this is, where there may have been some discussion of the responsibilities of the board being subsumed into the HSE board. I'm not sure whether that is legally possible. I don't know all of the circumstances around the Minister, but what I would say is that every option has to be on the table to ensure that there is good governance and good management. And could I also put it to you, Minister, because I say this sincerely and genuinely, there was a task force that was set up as well into Children's Health Ireland. Many parents at the time said to me, I can't sign up to a task force because I don't have confidence in the same people in Children's Health Ireland who have let us down so badly and are responsible for all of those failures. So I can again understand that from those parents. But we do have a situation, Minister, at the moment where there is an expert panel going to be established to look at and evaluate each individual case. I welcome that. That is necessary. I want every single child to have their case reviewed, but it has to be at arm's length to Children's Health Ireland. I know you have said that will be the case. Obviously, I want to see the terms of reference and the criteria and all of that when that is published. But we have to make sure, Minister, that in everything we do now, families and children are put first. Because, to be frank, they haven't been up to date. Families contacted me yesterday to say that the phone line, and while some of them were grateful that at least there was a hotline, that in reality they felt, to use their words, that the people on the other end, through no fault of their own, could not provide them answers and were using what they thought responses to frequently asked questions, and they just felt let down by that. And that just compounds an anger and a frustration that those families have. So let's put children and families first in relation to everything that we now do to establish the facts and to make sure these children get the care that they need. I want to finish and use my remaining minutes, Cappagh, to deal with the other issue that came into the public domain as well in relation to the potential of manipulating public waiting lists. And again, I have a high regard for consultants who do a fantastic job. I know and I supported and I'm on the record for supporting the government putting in place a public-only contract. It's a really important transition that we need to make to remove private healthcare from public hospitals. I very publicly welcomed that at the time because that was the responsible thing to do, and I called for it and I want to see it in our public hospitals. But I have been concerned for some time in relation to the use of public money within insourcing in hospitals to deal with waiting lists. That's necessary. We know that we need waiting list initiatives because waiting times were too high, but I have been raising concerns in relation to the potential of conflicts of interest, perverse incentives, and I would argue as well productivity within the public system. So I think we have to be asking genuine questions here about what work are some consultants doing on a Monday to Friday when they're paid on a Monday to Friday to carry out public procedures, and contrast that against the so-called blitzes and private clinics that they're organising and running as well, and charging €200 per client that they see and making very handsome amounts of money. If it is the situation, Minister, and I know this is a contention, and I know that that investigation, internal as it was, has not been published. I think that was a mistake, by the way, not only not to publish it, but not to forward that to this is the investigation into this practice of a consultant. No, but there was an internal one that the head of the HSE had said that he only got sight of, and he seemed to be angry about the fact that the first he heard of it was when this broke in the media. And I would assume it's the same for yourself, and I think that's unacceptable. I know there is further investigations now into this as well. But I'm making the point that we have a system in this state where you go to a GP, you are referred to a consultant, you're on that consultant's list, and there are bespoke options in some hospitals. Some hospitals do now operate what's called a centralised referral system, but it wasn't the case in every situation, and it doesn't seem to be the case in every situation. And there is the potential then for a perverse incentive, as I said, for a consultant to manipulate public waiting list, delay people getting access to care. In this case, the allegation is that it was children, which in my view makes it all the worse. And doing that, delaying care and not allowing other surgeons and other healthcare practitioners to treat those children, simply to treat them on a Saturday or Sunday and make money out of it. And I don't know how widespread that is, but wherever it happens, it has to be rooted out. My understanding as well, Cathaoirleach, is that the CEO of the National Treatment Purchase Fund is not responsible to any Oireachtas committee. She's not an accounting officer, or he, whoever that person is. I think that's a mistake. There are lots and lots of issues, and there's huge amounts of public money being spent by the National Treatment Purchase Fund. I know they have particular responsibilities in relation to setting nursing home fees, and I accept that they need to be independent in coming to those conclusions and not being affected by political influence. But when it comes to the huge amounts of money that's spent, and you're a former member of the Public Accounts Committee, you will know how important it is to achieve transparency. I think that there are major issues now that need to be examined. I've spoken to the current head of the HSE, and I have said that for me there are issues, as I said, in relation to perverse incentives and productivity of consultants across the system. But I would also say conflicts of interest. Because if you have a situation, and again I know this is an allegation and it's a contention, but if it is the case that what is reported, that this person delayed care for children, then made an application through the hospital for funding for the NTPF to treat the same children, and that didn't disclose that he was going to be the surgeon carrying out those private procedures at €200 a pop, that's a major conflict of interest that was not managed. Major conflict of interest. So I'm deeply concerned about all of that. And I suppose in the remaining minute that I have, Minister, I've genuinely dealt with, I would say, hundreds of parents over the last number of months. Even today I checked and I had 14 emails from parents in the couple of hours before I came in here. I simply couldn't do justice to all of them in relation to the accounts that they gave to me of their experience. But suffice to say that for all of them, they feel hurt, they feel let down, they felt that they weren't listened to, they felt that they're still being failed, they're going to have to wait. Now, we don't know how long it's going to be before this expert panel is established, but they feel very, very angry. And I want to be part of helping to restore the trust that they have. But unless, in whatever arrangements are now put in place, there is a voice for parents and a voice for advocate groups, I don't think that trust will be repaired. And I think that is hugely problematic. So we have a lot to do, all of us, and particularly those in government have a lot to do to repair the damage, to repair the trust, which undoubtedly needs to happen if parents are to have trust in CHI again. Gurmagat.
Thank you, Deputy Condan. Deputy Marie Sharrock.
Gurmagat, Las Ciancorla. I think, Minister, I want to just say it's very welcome that we are having statements on this evening, although I think I, for one, would be much rather that we're talking about all the many other issues in the health service, the huge inequalities that we see, particularly in our primary care system. But we're back again talking about CHI this evening. And I think, you know, when we look at the revelations at the weekend on top of the report last week, we're seeing anxiety levels now with parents through the roof in terms of their questions about trust and confidence in the individual hospitals that make up CHI. And of course, from talking to both doctors and nurses within CHI itself, I'm just really struck by how morale is on the floor at this stage. This drip feed revelation is so damaging to the excellent work that so many of them are providing day in, day out. I think if I counted correctly, we've had 4 externally commissioned reviews over just 3 years in CHI, each looking at a very specific aspect of care in CHI. And of course, 3 are published. We're waiting for the NIMGAN report. And 2 have, I suppose, what I might call systemic recommendations, both the Boston Hospital Review and HICWA. Obviously, the Stephen Thomas report was much more confined to pelvic ostomies. But between Boston Hospital and HICWA, I think we've had something like 59 recommendations, if I count them up correctly. And many of these recommendations arise from the same conclusion that there was systemic cultural, clinical and management failures, and many of the recommendations point to the same fundamental reforms. And of course, some of these recommendations are going back to 2023, and we're still not in any way clear that those reforms are actually fully underway. I suppose when we look on Sunday at the internal inquiry in CHI and their stunning revelations, so on top of the appalling allegations that, you know, children were not cared for in a timely manner, that there was a possible abuse of the NTPF, I find it incredible that both, it seems, the Department of Health, yourself, Minister, and the HSE appear to have been kept in the dark, and it's a reflection of the level of dysfunction at the very top of CHI that was not communicated to yourselves, particularly because of this kind of semi-permanent state of crisis that CHI finds itself in. I very much welcome the moves that you have made over the weekend. I welcome with regards to the appointment of the HSE board members, with regards to the enhanced operational oversight by the HSE. We've also been looking, I suppose, at the reports of the legal advice that your predecessor received last year with regards to the HSE, you know, I suppose that substantive and fundamental change of governance at the top of CHI. And I suppose to be very clear that we in the Labour Party will not be found wanting if legislation is brought to this House in terms of ultimately bringing the board of CHI under the full operational oversight of the HSE, because to have a situation as we have had over recent weeks where the HSE are effectively accounting for the failures of an organisation that they don't have full operational control and oversight is simply daft. And I think it was very telling that the HSE have had to come in, particularly in terms of even the briefing on Friday, in terms of the setup of the external review, that it is them as opposed to CHI that are very much, along with the Department of Health, leading on this. I want to make clear that I suppose from any of my conversations on the ground that I understand that the new CEO of CHI is somebody who people speak very highly of, and I think that is very welcome, but I'm not sure that it's, I suppose, in itself enough anymore in terms of the governance of CHI. To the Stephen Thomas report itself, and I have a number of questions. Why is the review only going back to 2010? As I understand it, it's because those children born in that year are now currently ageing out of the paediatric children's hospital services. But there are children older than that, 17, 18 and slightly older, whose parents have also raised concerns with me about whether those children were caught up in the unnecessary hip, the pelvic ostomy procedures. I think, if I heard correctly, the CEO of the HSE, who I have great time for on Sunday, saying that it was believed that the audits, that there was a situation with the clinical audits, that you know, there was some reference made to 2010. But I understand, talking to other surgeons, that practice of clinical audits goes way back and is a key part of all surgical training, so that it, you know, has not been embedded into the oversight procedures within CHI is very stark in itself. I think the other question I have is that while the offer from the HSE with regards to the external review is confined to patients with who've undergone pelvic ostomies, and the protected disclosure, of course, related specifically to that, I have to ask you, Minister, are you confident that there weren't other procedures conducted by those same surgeons that may have also been deemed unnecessary or perhaps not meeting the international standards for clinical indication? Because I think there's a whole air of distrust now with regards to all the procedures that have been undergone. Also, the review, as I understand it, or certainly the review that was published on Friday related to children under the age of 7, 7 and under, who had the pelvic ostomy operations. But again, I've had a family contact me whose daughter was 13, who underwent a very similar procedure. The family at the time felt the decision was quite rushed, but nonetheless they were in the hands of the surgeons. And I suppose my ask is that in terms of the opening up of the external review, that it would be opened up to those children older than 7. And then one of the last questions I have then is that the change with regards to this new single peer-led review by surgeons, or sorry, of a team of all surgical decision making. Is that only for pelvic ostomies or for all surgical procedures within CHI now? And I think that is a critical question. I suppose I raised the issue some weeks ago about the status of current activity within CHI. You know, have surgeons been referred to the Medical Council? Has activity been temporarily suspended or reduced while these reviews were ongoing? I understand that that's not the case. But, you know, I think there's also a situation where we know that there is somewhere like 220 children currently waiting orthopaedic procedures at this point in time. Those families are obviously deeply worried now that there'll be any sort of reduction in activity, and we need to provide assurances to them. To the steps being taken now and to the letters being sent out, I suppose the question has to be asked, with all that has gone on, how could CHI be so tone deaf as to insert in their letters that just one parent attends? And perhaps, Minister, you might be able to clarify on that, because the parents who've contacted me used the word broken, that they feel broken, that their confidence has been shattered because, of course, of just the uncertainty. Have they put their child through an unnecessary procedure? And I want to just refer to one woman who contacted my colleague, Deputy Mark Wall, today, who actually secured a review of her 3 children had undergone pelvic ostomies, and she secured a review with the surgeon 2 weeks ago, and there was an x-ray and was followed up by a meeting with the consultant, and she was asking the questions, and she was told by the surgeon that he had done her children a favour in terms of the future of her children, and I suppose she's not sure now who to believe anymore. So in terms of the follow-up care, who precisely is going to be providing that follow-up care that has been committed to now for every child who's undergone pelvic ostomy? Is it the surgeon who's undertaken the procedure, or is it going to be somebody different? And just because I'm conscious I've only a few seconds left, I think there are serious questions now about the NTPF, and this relates, I suppose, to the allegations that were made on Sunday.
Thank you, Deputy.
Obviously, we'd like that report to be published as soon as possible, but there are serious questions now about the NTPF, and I believe an audit needs to be undertaken of the processes of the NTPF.
Deputy Erin McGrath.
Cappagh, Minister, I welcome this opportunity to speak on this hugely concerning matter, and it has, I suppose, rocked so many families across the country. The occurrences of, lack of any sort of organisation or accountability within the CHI is really grave. It has, as I said, rocked every parent. It has really devastated families affected, and it really does shake to the foundations of the public trust within our healthcare system. And what has happened in Children's Health Ireland can only be described at the minute as an extreme crisis. What was supposed to be a beacon of excellence for paediatric care in this country, it's mirrored in dysfunction, delay and disillusionment with a long list of mistakes. Today, the further resignations of the board is just symptomatic of this. The results of the recent audit into the paediatric hip surgeries conducted by Children's Health Ireland and the National Orthopaedic Hospital Cappagh has exposed systematic failures. The findings of the audit are stark and beyond alarming. The majority of the procedures, pelvic osteotomies, looked at in the audit carried out by CHI Temple Street, 60%, and in the National Orthopaedic Hospital in Cappagh, 79% did not meet the clinical indication on the agreed standard applied for the audit. The majority of procedures looked at in Crumlin was 98%. did meet the indication. The report further states that while the worldwide variability between surgeons and the variance identified in this cannot be accounted for by the measurement error or observer variability alone, surgeries identified carried out without sufficient clinical justification means that children undergone operations that they were not only inappropriately but potentially harmful. This issue goes beyond medical error, it's an ethical failure. It's absolutely disgusting. And Minister, if a child underwent surgery that's not necessary, it's not a clinical misstep, it's an assault on their wee person, their health and the trust. To perform a procedure without just cause is really unconscionable violation. Minister, where do the families turn to now when trust is gone? How can they place their child into the care of the same hospitals now? The health services have really a lot of work to do, and I hope this can be rectified, but the appalling allegations will make it difficult. Minister, I've spoken to mothers of children who've had this surgery and they feel lost in bureaucracy and the need to have the answers very quickly and efficiently. Their children learning to walk again, children discharged in agony, given incredibly strong drugs with no follow-up. It is incredibly upsetting. When I think of the size of those wee people that have been affected by it, it's unbearable, to be honest. Transparency and openness and flexibility to support those families is necessary. But Minister, I had a mother contact me who has immediately lost confidence because when they called the phone line on Friday, the person who answered did not know the answers and she had to spell out Cappagh to the individual when she was taking the notes. It doesn't instill confidence. The government must take immediate steps to address the shortcomings revealed in this audit. I welcome the clear plan by you, outlined by you, Minister. I hope there is cooperation with you and with the follow-up. Transparency is needed and the families need to get answers. Children need to get proper follow-up care and also trauma-informed care. If they also do not wish to go back to the hospital where they are treated, they should be given financial support to travel to get follow-up care they require. Personally, I would find it very, very hard to place my child back into a care of a hospital that potentially butchered my child. Another point I want to highlight, Minister, and I hope it will be investigated and has been touched on across the House this evening. We need to check whether there was a correlation between patients having private health insurance and unnecessary surgeries. The families that I have spoken to had private health insurance and feel sick because they tried to do their best by their family to get the health insurance, get better care, and they feel they may have been taken advantage of by getting a quick buck by the hospital. Minister, the governance issues must be worked upon in an incredibly efficient manner. Parents and children need to know everything about their time under the care of the hospitals. Care must be given, support must be given, alternative medical follow-up must also be given. Accountability for all the wrongdoing must come without haste. Trust must be instated. And Minister, I wish you the very best of luck because you have a hard job of work. The government did not do this, but it is the government's job to clean it up. Girl, my gut.
Deputy Mark Daly.
Thank you, Concorla. Minister, it's with significant regret that I have to speak today. I'm a member of the medical profession, not an orthopaedic specialist, but a doctor of nearly 40 years standing. The Thomas audit of the management of developmental dysplasia of hips in children in CHI Tempest Street in Crumlin and the National Orthopaedic Hospital Cappagh is deeply disappointing and unsettling, most especially as it follows on from the use of non-medical grade springs in spinal surgery in CHI. My thoughts are primarily with the children that Mr. Simon Thomas states clearly should not have been operated upon, and their families. The trust patients and families place in doctors is the bedrock of our profession. That trust has been ruptured in Tempest Street in Cappagh by some surgeons who must now explain their actions. These were not marginal decisions. Another hospital, namely Crumlin, in the same group of hospitals in the same small city, followed a starkly different standard of practice and have been vindicated in the Thomas audit. The Thomas audit into the management of DDH in children has brought clarity within the limitations of its terms of reference. However, it raises many new questions about governance, ethics, consent, clinical judgment and decision-making. This is more than clinical misjudgment. It shows some surgeons strayed far from evidence-based practice, ignoring internationally accepted protocols. While Thomas notes that some variance in DDH management could be expected, the variance of pelvic osteotomy rates across CHI Crumlin, Tempest Street and Cappagh are inexplicable, in the order of 60 to 80%. no plausible explanation was offered. Minister, I acknowledge your swift response to the official audit report and welcome the appointment of 2 HSE board members to the CHI board, the increased operational oversight of CHI by way of an enhanced service level agreement, the cross-hospital interdepartmental peer review group for consideration of any further surgeries, and the commitment by you and the Taoiseach to an independent external review process. However, broader questions remain around CHI's culture and governance and its relationship with the HSE. This is especially urgent in light of reports alleging unethical and irregular referral practices by a consultant in an internal CHI report, and the alleged toxic workplace environment for junior staff. The non-action by management in response to that report is simply incredible. However, our immediate concern must be the care of affected children and families. Proper follow-up to skeletal maturity must be carried out, standard best practice that was lacking in Temple Street and Cappagh. Every case must now be independently reviewed back to 2010. This is a major undertaking, but essential, and we must ensure it doesn't further delay care for children awaiting surgery. It is incumbent upon government and this House to tease out the systemic failures this DDH debacle has revealed. The key issues are managerial culture and governance, clinical culture and governance, and the process of clinical decision-making at Temple Street and Cappagh. In many hospitals, critical, robust, collegial peer review of cases is standard before any treatments are carried out. We need to understand why some surgeons deviated so sharply from accepted practice. Thomas suggests a small subgroup of surgeons carried out a significant number of pelvic osteotomies, especially an unusual number of bilateral pelvic osteotomies. These must prompt professional reflection, remediation, and accountability by the appropriate bodies. Informed consent must also be addressed. Thomas details what adequate consent looks like and highlights poor record keeping, underlining the urgency of hospital digitalisation. The Health Committee should explore these matters to clarify the management culture and governance of CHI and Cappagh and the practices of individual surgeons. As I have said, it gives me no pleasure to make this statement, but we are obliged to act. The failures highlighted in the Thomas report, the apparent governance vacuum at Temple Street and Cappagh, serves no one well, not the children, not their families, not the medical profession, and certainly not the state. We must learn from those mistakes.
And we move now to Deputy Pierce Doherty.
And Minister, when you read the report, words kind of fail you. We've heard words over the last number of days of shocked, of disgraceful, parents dealing with the anger, the emotions, as my party colleague Mary Lou MacDonald mentioned earlier on, one parent feeling that they let their child down. And that's an emotion that many parents that I've spoke to, and it's the wrong emotion because it wasn't them that let their child down, it was the state, it was the system, it was CHI, it was Temple Street, it was Cappagh, it was governance, and I would argue as well it was the state, it was government. And when we're used to hearing about scandals and we're used to hearing about reports, but we have to remember when we're talking about numbers of 80% of operations at Cappagh that weren't necessary and 60% in Temple Street, that every single one of those is a child. We're talking about hundreds of little girls and little boys that went into an operating theatre that had serious invasive surgery carried out in them on their hips, learning how to walk again, a bit of their childhood stolen from them. And we're not talking about 1, 2 or 3, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children. And how did this go on, not for 1 year or 2 years, but likely for quite a number of years? We know of parents who went for second opinions, and the consultants told them, you don't need the operation, you don't even have the condition. and said words that were relayed back to me is that we are alarmed at what is happening in Dublin. How was none of this noticed? How over years of my colleagues standing on these sides of the benches, raising issues, different issues in relation to CHI and governance issues, that government hasn't taken a deep dive into CHI and actually looked at what's going on? How come when the leaked report came out, and I stood here at this point 2 months ago and says, get ahead of this. This is a scandal of the likes we have never seen. That still today, parents in my constituency in Donegal and right throughout the state do not know how they will have that independent analysis assessment which they want to know whether their child needed that operation or not. How come that over them 2 months that one parent sent 30 emails with no response, only to get a response when they threatened legal action? And you know what the response they got last week was? We will be in touch with you in the coming months. Thank you,
Deputy.
This is a disgrace. Yes. It is a disgrace of governance. It is a failure of practitioners. But it is also, I must say, a failure of government to get ahead of this issue and deal with this issue when it was brought to your attention quite a number of months ago, Minister.
Deputy Pádraig Rice, Social Democrats.
Minister, it's really hard to know where to start when it comes to CHI. The report that was published, as others have said, is shocking, disturbing and deeply upsetting for families across the country. And it confirms what we've known and what we've said in the House for some time, that unnecessary surgeries took place on children. We know now what happened. We need to know why that happened. Minister, I've got a list of questions longer than my arm that need to be answered. And I do say this as a new TD. I find this format of long statements without, and us posing these questions without getting direct answers, I don't think it works. And Ciarán, I'd ask you maybe just to think about that, about the functioning of the House, because I think what would be far more beneficial for us, for the families, for people affected, is if we could pose our questions and get direct answers from the Minister and have that time for the back and forth direct engagement, because there are lots of serious questions that have been raised here over the last hour or so, and we yet haven't got a chance to hear any of the answers from the Minister. So I'd ask, in terms of the functioning of the House, that we do our job better for the families and get direct answers to our questions. And I'll start just some of them, Minister. I have just, I suppose, 10 questions that I would like your answer to in your reply. One, I suppose, how long is the external review going to take? Do we know how far back this issue goes? We know that letters have been dated back to 2010, but does this go back further? Are we looking at something that goes back to the early 2000s? There's been reference to a published academic paper, but what is that paper based on? Is that based on surgeries that happened before that? And we need to know how deep this issue runs. Is there going to be further investigation to determine how the scandal arose and persisted so long without anyone in CHI or Cappagh being aware? Will the Minister conduct a review of clinical directors? Could children under the care of CHI surgeon in other hospitals be affected? We know that they worked in other hospitals such as UHG. Crucially, and it was referenced by others, has financial incentive been completely ruled out as a motivating factor here? Have any doctors been placed on leave? Are any doctors contesting the findings of this report? Are there any legal proceedings against CHI as a result of this scandal? And does the Minister trust CHI to take on the running of the National Children's Hospital? And this was there just 10 of the many questions that I have, that others have, that parents have. And I think they're questions that we would like to get answers to. And as we go through this report, and as we delve through it, there's going to be more questions that need answers. To that end, in my capacity as the chair of the Audit Health Committee, I've written to CHI and I've invited them to come before the committee. I and the other members would expect that to happen quickly and not be delayed. And hopefully we'll have that engagement with them sooner rather than later, because I think we need to get answers to these questions. The report raises really serious concerns around the novel procedure and serious failings in terms of informed consent. Lack of clinical follow-up is another key issue. And what we need to see now is that independent panel established quickly, and key that there be independence there for families, because they're quite worried about the lack of independence. I think that needs to be put in place. The report, which I read through more than once, trying to get my head around it, highlights many issues around poor record keeping, the different criteria applying in different hospitals, which is deeply worrying, the lack of oversight, indications of children having complications. So there are many issues that need to be addressed, and urgently, I would say. One of the things I would suggest to the Minister in future in terms of these kind of issues, particularly those of a real technical nature, and of a medical audit like this, I think it would be worthwhile publishing an easy-to-understand guide at the same time for families, and having a version that people can understand. Because I'm reading through this report, I struggle to understand as somebody who isn't a medic, but I do think it's worthwhile having something that is easier to understand for families and parents that is also issued at the same time. And like others, I would like to commend the whistleblower for raising these concerns, and also the parents and families who have been raising issues. And some of them do feel like they haven't been heard. They say that over many years they have been raising concerns around CHI, around practices, and they feel stonewalled, they feel unheard. And I think that culture needs to change. And we do know there are serious issues with culture. The HIC report talks about the issues around culture, around governance, around the lack of communication, lack of oversight. So there are many, many issues there that do need to be addressed. And as I say, this isn't the only serious concerns the CHI has others have addressed in terms of the unauthorised springs, and then most recently the reports of the weekend around the National Treatment Purchase Fund. And like others, I'd like to see that published. I'd like to know whether there's been a referral to the Gardaí. I'd like to know whether there's been a referral to the Medical Council, what actions have taken place on foot of that, and because the report is deeply disturbing around patients being cherry-picked and put onto the private list in order to make more money, and also the lack of oversight there, or the lack of awareness by the HSE and the Department of Health on that is also deeply worrying. And in terms of the National Treatment Purchase Fund, we're talking about very large volumes of money, €240 million, and we have to ensure that money is being spent correctly, and these reports are deeply worrying. Minister, in particular, and as my party deputy leader raised this morning, we have in the Social Democrats deep concerns around the clinical directors. As you know, these are consultants who've been given the task of supervising their colleagues, receiving an additional allowance for that work. Introduced in 2008 to ensure the consultants were adhering to their contracts. In 2017, Primetime Investigates revealed consultants were gaming the system in many ways. At the time, the Social Democrats raised serious concerns about the role of clinical directors, and the latest revelations at CHI show that the clinical oversight is still an issue, and we want to know how were these practices happening under the noses of highly paid clinical directors, and we'd like to see that system reviewed. I'd like to know the number of clinical directors employed by the health service, where they're based, the number of consultants they're overseeing, and the reporting arrangements in place. Because I think a lot of this does come back to clinical governance, and that needs to be looked at. And I'd say, Minister, I welcome your interventions over the weekend, particularly in terms of the appointments to the board and the swift action you've taken on that. And I think that work needs to be commended. And from our perspective, we want answers and not heads. We do need to know what happened at CHI. But we do have fundamental questions around what is the purpose of CHI? Is CHI needed? What is the plan for CHI going forward? This is HSE funded, but not HSE controlled, and I think there are serious issues there. And there's issues about building in these additional layers that we might not need in our health service, and whether the HSE can directly manage these hospitals. And in terms of the National Children's Hospital, we're talking about a €2.2 billion hospital, as you know. So we need to get this right. We spent time and carefully consider it, but I would ask for that to be part of the Minister's consideration. And in terms of just the bigger picture, there seems to be just the lack of controls and lack of accountability. In the Social Democrats, we've long argued that the mix of public and private together in that uncontrolled and without that lack of accountability is toxic for our health service. And this is why we fundamentally believe in delivery of universal healthcare and delivery of sláinte care. And I think that needs to be accelerated, though, Minister. Like, we are now a number of years into a 10-year plan, and we don't believe that it's happening quickly enough. And until we deliver universal healthcare that is free at the point of use, delivered in community, delivered based on need and not ability to pay, we are going to see these issues again and again and again, and we're going to face future scandals. So I think while this is looking at one particular issue in one particular hospital, in one particular section, the issues are systematic, and they won't be addressed until we fundamentally rebuild and reform our healthcare services and deliver universal healthcare services that are enjoyed by people all across Europe, that are single tier, that are high quality. So I do think that we do need to collectively, as an Oireachtas, get behind the agreed sláinte care reform plans and accelerate those, because children of Ireland deserve better than what we're seeing in these reports and these scandals after scandals after scandals.
Thank you, Deputy. We now move to Government Slot Deputy Peter Roach.
Thank you very much, Cancórla. And can I say, firstly, Minister, you have inherited quite I suppose, a difficult situation that, and I've no doubt with your response, your hands-on approach and the swift action that you've taken, and I read that in the report, that you know, you mean business, and rightly so. And it's shameful, really, that we have to be talking about, you know, this kind of a calamity happening in modern day medicine. Is just, it's hard to believe. And you sit at home and you listen to the news reports, and you kind of say, not again. And it kind of beggars belief that you know, this day and age, this would be happening. But however, we are where we are, and thanks to the whistleblower, you know, great credit has to be given to that person who felt the need to highlight this. We don't want to hear about it, but it's a reality, and the fact that it is a reality, it now needs to be dealt with. And I suppose, Minister, it's entrusted in your good self to do that. But you know, when we, you know, take our children to hospital for care, you know, our most cherished children, we expect that they'll be in a safe place, and we certainly expect that they would be cared for in the trust of the professionals, you know, caring for them, confident in the knowledge that every decision is grounded in evidence and compassion and, of course, accountability. And the findings of CHI audit raises deep and troubling questions about whether that trust was upheld. We've also heard that Crumlin Hospital, nearly all surgeries reviewed were found to have been appropriately selected for surgery based on current international standards, and that's good. But at Temple Street and Cappagh, you know, it has raised serious concerns about decision making, where a significant number of procedures were carried out without meeting the acceptable clinical criteria, including surgeries on children where stable hips and no prior treatment for DDH. Families, and rightly so, families are being contacted on this issue. Because fundamental questions have been raised, and you know, the question we all ask is, how did this happen, and why was it allowed to happen, and where were the checks and the balances, and why was the governance so weak, and then most importantly, you know, how can we ensure that there's no repeat of it across any sector, you know, and there's not a, you know, there's no question, you know, of clinical variation. As the report makes clear, the scale of unjustified procedures cannot be explained by differences in judgment alone. I welcome that these patients are being reviewed, recalled for review, and that the HSE is now establishing, under the Minister's watch, an independent expert panel, which I think that's really, really welcome. And that reassures me that, yes, we are sort of responding to the crisis and responding to the need. But this needs to be done not only for the families affected, but I also think that public confidence in our health service needs to be restored. Most importantly, all future DDH surgery decisions will be consistent, evidence-based, and focus solely on the best interest of the child. This is where governance must deliver, not as an abstract policy, but in real clinical decisions with real positives for real people. Because when governance fails, it's the patient who pays the price, and it mustn't happen again. We owe these families a lot of honesty, respect, and of course accountability. And as a member of the Health Forum, and Deputy Rice, our chair, and has referenced the fact that we will of course be hearing lots more about this, but it behoves us to respond in a very professional but also a very dignified way in terms of the way that we deal with these discussions. So look, it has been a lot of contributions, and there are a lot of people out there and a lot of public reps here that have suggested that they know some of these families, and of course I'm no different. I know one, and that brings the whole thing closer to home. But I commend you, Minister, as I said earlier, for your swift action, and we look forward to the independent review findings that will establish for us whether or not the surgeries that were carried out were necessary. And that, I think, that's most welcome. And of course, like I said earlier, we need to give reassurance to the general public. Gormahagat.
Hakti Leishin Irahalik.
Minister, parents are very worried tonight. They're worried that their child might have had an unnecessary operation. They look to the government for answers, but all they seem to get is an endless commentary. Now, I heard your commentator-in-chief on the news earlier, your boss, the Taoiseach. Jesus, he was outraged. He described in detail long lists of all of the people who he thinks should have been paying attention, conveniently forgetting his own role, a former Minister for Health, and the role of his own government in yet another scandal. Scoliosis scandal, cervical check scandal, Children's Hospital overrun scandal. The list goes on and on and on. And the questions that parents are asking, it's a fairly simple one, I suppose, could this have been avoided? The consultant identified by the 2021 internal investigation into CHI, who it is alleged was enriching him or herself at the expense of sick children, may be a pretty poor example of this behaviour, but the current system subsidises the failing of the public sector by funding the private sector. And your colleague, Deputy McGreenan, said it. She said the parents, these are her words now, they wanted to do their best for children and get the best care, and that's why they had private health insurance. Imagine that, from one of your own colleagues. Private health insurance. Get yourself as far away from the public system as controlled by your government as you possibly can. Do right by your kids. Get private health insurance. Jeez, that's some message. That is some message for parents, because I don't know what you're saying to the parents who can't afford private health insurance. I mean, I don't know what the message to them is this evening. But you have created a system whereby there are two tiers. Mechanisms like the National Treatment Purchase Fund create perverse incentives. Now, it's 7 years since I met with the now Taoiseach, then Minister for Health. And I outlined to him a proposal that was a Sinn Féin proposal, but it works in other jurisdictions, and we had modified it for this particular jurisdiction, and we called it COLISTA, a single integrated waiting list management system, which would remove those perverse incentives and ensure that the health service was working at maximum capacity, so that a person who was waiting could get the next best place for them. It would eliminate, to a huge extent, the perverse incentives that apparently have been highlighted now. Those perverse incentives have served to let children down. And in my final few seconds, Minister, I will say this. Parents will have a voice in this chamber, because we will ensure that they have a voice in this chamber. Thank you for heckling me, Minister. Thank you. This is my time. This is my time.
Deputy, your time is up. Minister, we've seen it all at this stage. We've had unnecessary hip operations. We've had unlicensed springs implanted into children. We've had defective technology being fixed during operations. We've had Wi-Fi. Every single week there is something new, and now we have a doctor who allegedly referred public patients to their private clinic at the weekend and was paid money by the National Treatment Purchase Fund, which is meant to be to expedite the most needy people first, but actually they weren't necessarily the children in the greatest need. So you keep saying, or your backbenchers keep thanking you, but you have to listen to parents here, because we just heard an apology in the previous session to parents. We're going to be back here, we all know it, apologising to parents, and you're just stringing this out for as long as possible. In the 2 minutes I have, I don't have time to make all the research points that I just want to say what the parents believe at this stage needs to be done. HSE was proposing a two-stage operation, or two-stage review, firstly by the CHI and then by outside. That's completely rejected. They are putting forward the idea of a partial ratified independent scrutiny mechanism, as it's called, PRISM, where the parents themselves would have, you know, a say in what happens here and would have scrutiny over the whole situation. And they are so knowledgeable, Minister, it's actually incredible. I know, I'm sure you've met them. There has to be a full comprehensive review. Every parent and child should be entitled to a second opinion, not to have to wait 6 months as is currently being proposed. And we need a full public inquiry into CHI. We need every single case should be audited, not just the chosen cases. And Minister, we all know that this has just been strung out. That board need to go. There's no way they can move forward in terms of CHI into a new system. It's absolutely ruled out.
Thank you, Councillor.
Sorry, what's I doing?
Minister, as someone who has worked for over 21 years as a hospital administrator in a general hospital, I'm lost for words to describe the mayhem which is Children's Hospital Ireland. Bewilderment comes to mind. Shocking, certainly. The first principle of provision of a health service is that the patient comes first. Old-fashioned, you might say, but still 100% true. There's been a fundamental breach of trust here, which has not only not put the patient first, but which has harmed patients, in this case children. A series of reviews, reports, audits and investigations, including HICWA, the HSE and others, paint a picture of a toxic, chaotic system, a toxic, chaotic systemic failure at all levels, at governance level, at clinical oversight, breaches of procedures, breaches of guidelines and breaches of protocol. Putting children through pain and suffering through surgery for developmental dysplasia of the hip that may not have been necessary in 70% of cases is simply unconscionable. Parents of these children are devastated and they have no confidence in the review process being proposed, and they are rightly asking for a public inquiry and an independent clinical review by independent international paediatric orthopaedic surgeons, and are also demanding to be centrally involved in drawing up the terms of reference. The governance of the hospital must also be addressed, and I believe the board must be stood down and the operation, control and governance of the hospital transferred to the Health Service Executive, which currently funds the hospital.
Thank you, Chair. This is our second report and we're waiting on a third report. And this second report, we're told that the percentages of the pelvic procedures carried out not reaching the criteria are so high that a further inquiry is mandated. And you're going to do that now in relation to look back at all of the patients, and I welcome that. And then we look at what the percentages were, and I think we can't repeat them often enough, that the Children's Hospital Temple Street, 60% didn't, and 79% of Cappagh did not meet the clinical indication. So operations carried out at that high percentage that weren't necessary. And so in my short time, Minister, I welcome the changes you're making, but I want to zone in on the board of CHI, and I recognise that they're there with no remuneration. And it's a whole, actually, model that we need to look at. And I believe hospitals should be run by the health executive. And that board has been there for a very long time and put on a statutory footing in 19, on a statutory footing. There's been a huge turnover of directors, actually. And we had them before us on the public accounts on Thursday. And I take a lot of the blame myself, our inability to ask questions in a tiny space of time. But I was singularly unimpressed with what came before us at the public accounts. And you might look at it. So we had a new CEO who knew nothing about anything except to tell us that the previous settlement in relation to the previous CEO was confidential, but that CEO had a new name, same salary and nothing else. That CHI board also presided over $250,000 that they failed to collect from private insurances. And that Children's Health Ireland board was before us without a chairperson and without a single member of the board before us to account for anything. And then I'll finally finish on this in my short time. They refer to a report every year or an internal review carried out by external people, but they couldn't tell us anything about that because that was simply for them to learn. Now, you seem to have got one of those lately, but one is carried out every single year. They tell us in the financial statements to assure them that governance is. To me, I received no assurance. I'll stop.
Thank you, Deputy Paul Murphy.
Minister, I have a number of questions. First question is, why are the surgeons who performed hundreds of unnecessary surgeries on children, why are they still operating? Surgeon B could go into Temple Street tomorrow and do an osteotomy. They're not being prevented from doing that. There's a lot of talk of rebuilding trust and so on, but all that seems very previous to me when literally the surgeons who are responsible are still operating in Temple Street and in Cappagh. I think they should be suspended, but at the very least, they should be suspended from carrying out osteotomies. Secondly, is there any ongoing investigation into motive? My understanding is that if a child had private health insurance, a surgeon would get around €1,500 for doing one side and get another €750 on top for doing the other. That is a significant incentive that may well have distorted the best health outcome for children and shows the kind of poisonous role of private money in a public health system. Thirdly, Minister, are you confident that CHI agrees with you when you say there's going to be a full review of every osteotomy that was done to see whether they needed that operation? Not just that there's no complications, but whether they actually needed that operation. The parents don't need to request that. Of course, they'll need to consent to it, but that it should be across the board. You might check that CHI has the same understanding of it as you do. And fourthly, why are children earlier than 2010 being excluded? So that they're no longer children? Okay. But I mean, at the moment, what's mentioned here, say in the CHI press statement, is all of them being studied from 2010 at Temple Street. We know that these operations, these novel osteotomies, started in 2002. It doesn't seem to be there's any good reason to leave them out. I mean, the argument is, well, they've reached skeletal maturity, but you know, they still deserve to know, were they wrongly operated on or not? That still may have implications for their health into the future.
Thank you, Deputy Murphy. And now we move to a government slot. Deputy Colin Burke.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you for coming in here to the House this evening to deal with this issue. It is, I suppose, a really difficult time for children, but in particular for parents, because the children placed their trust in their parents, the parents placed their trust in the consultants and took their advice in coming to a decision about the best way of managing the medical care required. Simon Thomas from the British Royal Hospital, and he's there since 2007, carried out the review both in relation to Crumlin, in Temple Street and in Cappagh, and found a huge difference between Temple Street in the two hospitals together. Temple Street and Cappagh were doing something totally different to Crumlin, and Crumlin seemed to have been doing far less and not involved to the same extent, and were doing it following all the proper procedures in coming to decisions before they were doing these operations. The audit decision for the audit that was carried out was in relation to pelvic autonomy, and it was from the period January 2021 to December 2023. And it's interesting to read in paragraph 2.3 of the report, in many of the Temple Street and Cappagh cases sampled, there was no record of closed or open hip reduction after delayed diagnosis, no record of either hip ever having been dislocated, and often no history of treatment soon after birth by stent or brace for hip instability. and yet there were surgeries carried out where the evidence for the need for these surgeries didn't appear to be there. And I think it's accepted here in this House that the vast majority of consultants, of junior doctors, of nurses, of care assistants, and all the people that work in hospitals want to put the best foot forward and look after patients in the best possible way. The difficulty about this now is the lack of trust that has now been created as a result of this. And it will take a huge amount of time and effort in order to build that trust back up. And therefore, it's so important that we do everything possible to make sure that there is full disclosure, to make sure that the families whose children have gone through unnecessary operations are given the necessary support. And you know, it's interesting, we should have learned from history. You go back to a consultant a number of years ago who was doing unnecessary hysterectomies. That was identified in the last 15 years. We also had the whole issue in relation to symphysiotomy, which was, as one person said, he was sawing me in half. And that was a grotesque way of carrying out a medical procedure. It was in place of doing caesarean sections. And just while I'm talking about caesarean sections, about the need for checks and balances, Minister, and this is what I don't understand. I understood that in all of our hospitals, and regardless of the area of medicine you're in, whether it's orthopaedics, whether it is maternity, whether it's paediatrics, there is a checks and balances there. There's reviews carried out within hospitals on a regular basis. That doesn't appear to be being here in this case, because these procedures were being done since 2010. And for instance, just on maternity, it's interesting to see the figures for one hospital in Ireland for February of this month, where 73.5% of deliveries for first-time mothers were by way of caesarean section. And I would question the need for 73.5% to have caesarean section. It raises questions to know, are we now taking decisions in order to fast-track what needs to be done? And I really think that we now need to set up a proper system right across the board in all our hospitals, in all the different areas of medicine, to make sure that there's reviews carried out on a regular basis. I'm not talking about every year, but at least once in every 5 years. And I think it's something that we now need to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Cappagh. I welcome the report, but now it's imperative that there's no delay in the rollout of the recommendations. There are three key issues. Number one is the parents, how we deal with the parents. Since these letters, over 2,000 have been sent out, I've spoken to many, and without exaggeration, they simply haven't slept. They're totally numb. The thought of their child was put through a procedure that simply wasn't necessary. Many in this House understand what it's like to hand their child over to a surgeon in a hospital. The word trust comes to mind. But at the moment, that trust is completely broken between the healthcare system and these parents. And I'm asking the Minister to bear this in mind. With the consultations with the parents, they simply should not be sent back to the hospitals that already dealt with their children. A helpline of support is warmly welcomed, but as important, it's essential, and this is where it was great to see the report fully published for the parents, and they must be fully updated. I call for parents or their representatives to be included in the full review process. The children. I welcome the action that's been taken, that is going to be independent, clinically review on every case. And I welcome that there will be independent expertise outside of Ireland to conduct a thorough examination to ascertain if the operations were necessary. I understand the nature of this inspection will be complicated and timely, but bearing this in mind, I request that this process gets the full support of your department and this is carried out as quickly as possible. As previously mentioned, the stress of not knowing for a parent is simply hard to understand. Oversight. We must ensure that the management, oversight and procedures are in place, that this cannot happen again. What happened to the governance of CHI? As a parent who was lucky enough to reject such a call for procedure on my son, on the lips of every parent affected that I reached out to me are the questions why and how. Yes, I agree with the full review on the findings in a sober manner and allowing due process to all involved. But if we do not answer this parent's question, we are simply not doing our duty. Why would a surgeon suggest an unnecessary medical procedure on a child? The CHI have simply failed us on this. But individuals must be made accountable. That is the crux of this report. They have to stand up, they have to look themselves in the mirror. How this was allowed to happen in this century is simply inexcusable. I await the review of this report with huge personal interest. I'm aware that we, the government, are not responsible for this, but we are fully and firmly responsible on how we respond. Gormagod.
Independent, Sinn Féin Deputy Thomas Gould.
Minister, first I want to thank the whistleblower and express my gratitude and the gratitude of everyone for coming forward with this information. Parents need answers. Children must come first in this whole process. There needs to be open transparency and accountability, and children must have the follow-up care they need. 80% of the hip surgeries in Cappagh and 60% in Temple Street were unnecessary. It's just unbelievable. It's just unimaginable that that amount of surgeries took place on children that weren't needed. And every figure is a child. The department were notified last May, and we got the audit last summer. We're nearly into June, and people still don't have answers. They still don't have, they don't know if their child needed that surgery or didn't. In Cork, there are 32 families waiting to hear, waiting for answers. Every single person whose child has ever had hip surgery now has serious questions. And it is unbelievable that this has happened. Time and again, this state has failed children, the most vulnerable children. Those with thalidomide, those with scoliosis, mother and baby homes, children with disability. We have a child out there last week campaigning for the rights, the legal rights to have assessment of needs, because our government won't deliver what was promised, legally promised. Also, Minister, I say every child, no matter what their age now, who could be affected or was affected by these unnecessary operations or doesn't know if they were unnecessary, must be included in the process and have their voices heard. Where was the oversight? Where were the checks and balances? Like, how could this happen? There are hundreds of children in the world, hundreds of children. How could it happen? There are serious questions here about private health care. Minister, something needs to be done now, radical. Every year or every second year we have a scandal after a scandal. When will it stop? I know from my own personal experience what it's like to have a sick child. I know from personal experience what it's like when you're failed by, I can say, the vast majority of doctors, consultants do a brilliant job, but some of them don't.
Thank you, Deputy.
And I say this to last Councillor, I remember talking to a doctor one time who'd failed my family.
Thank you, Deputy.
They were worried about being sued. I was worried about my child.
Thank you.
I get what these parents are going through, and they need answers now.
Independent Technical Group Deputy Richard O'Donnell.
Thank you, Councillor. Accountability is at the very start of this. And Minister, you're knowing your role and you've hit the ground running, and I appreciate that. But what's happening in Cappagh Hospital and Temple Street Hospital is unforgivable, and accountability has to happen. We can look at it and nod our heads all day long, but at least now we're going the right direction. No more hiding. No more hiding for anyone. We saw in UHL, my first speech here in the Dáil was about management in UHL, and it has finally changed. They have a big task ahead of them, but it's changed. I now have somebody that will answer a phone to me. I have a minister that will answer a phone to me. I have management that will answer a phone to me. And they will listen to what's happening within the hospital system. There are some fantastic consultants out there. There's some fantastic people across all the networks of hospitals. And then you get a minority that take advantage. But that goes back to management. It has to go back to, and there has to be accountability. Now, management, some of them have resigned at the moment. It's not enough. We need to make sure there's accountability for what has happened to those children and also what has happened to the parents. But one thing we should also look into, Minister, is, to me, it's criminal activity if operations were carried out for reward of money and they didn't need to be carried out. If this was embezzlement from any other companies, people would be looking at the money trail of this. Why don't we look at the money trail of this and go back to those consultants that took out those operations that didn't need to be happening? Did they do it for a financial reward, or did they do it for the best practice of a child? And this report will actually show that. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. Minister, the people parents most trust in the world are the doctors, are the surgeons who are supposed to care for their children. This is one of the most atrocious breaches of trust that can be believed. Imagine, without your knowledge, someone who is supposed to care for your child implants a device which should never be allowed to be done. And in compounding that, we find out that there are operations which have been carried out on young children which are not necessary. Independent Ireland has a plan, simple plan: put patients first, hold leaders accountable, and make the health service safe and fair for all. Right now, the HSE is too big, too closed off and too untouchable. That's why we want to create a real watchdog, fully independent of the HSE, to monitor what hospitals are doing. If something is being covered up, we want criminal prosecutions to be possible, not just an internal memo. We believe in protecting whistleblowers, nurses, doctors or staff who speak up should be safe, not punished. In the postcode lottery, if you live outside a major city, you know how hard it can be to get proper care. That's why we call for more funding to small regional hospitals, so people in rural Ireland aren't left behind. Our policy says 45% of the population live outside cities. They deserve access to urgent and routine care 24/7, just like everyone else. Clear the waiting list. It's no secret that people are waiting months, even years, for procedures in Ireland. That's not just frustrating, it's dangerous. We support using private hospitals, both in the Republic and in Northern Ireland, to get people the care they need faster, which I have been doing for the last number of years with our Belfast Our Blind Service, a service myself and Deputy Denny Healy raised up. I also have the HIP operation service too. We also want to expand the elective surgery centres to stop endless cycle of cancellations and backlogs. We need to rebuild trust when children are harmed, when parents are left in the dark, and when no one is held responsible. Trust is broken. We need every family affected by the hip surgery scandal to be given clear explanations, a full medical review of their child, and support their child has been harmed, and to move forward here.
Deputy Ken O'Flynn.
Thank you. To sit still while children are cut open without cause is not policy, it's barbarism masquerading as procedure. Minister, the nation has watched in horror over 500 children, babies, toddlers, subjected to major hip surgeries without proper medical justification. This is not just clinical error, this is systemic betrayal and a violation of duty. The Department of Health and the HSE knew. They were warned by whistleblowers. We congratulate and thank the whistleblower today for that. But but nonetheless, HSE did nothing. People that the whistleblower went to did nothing. That is a failure. It is not just a failure, it is complacency. Today, the Taoiseach spoke about world-class health services and mentioned the Children's Hospital. But let me give you a real-world fact. Ireland pays out more in medical negligence claims per capita than almost any other EU country. Over 2.5 billion paid out in this decade. That's more than any other health system our size. And still just a few resignations, no consequences and no accountability. And when it comes to healthcare in this country, it's quite obvious Europe is moving forward while Ireland is moving backwards. We're the outlier of the European Union in cost, in care, in basic clinical responsibility. So let me be clear, this government cannot be trusted to investigate itself. I welcome that there will be an independent investigation, but it must have statutory powers, it must have no redactions, and it must have no delays and no whitewashing. Many people on the Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil benches today have spoke about progress, but where they say progress, I see failure. Where the promises of reform, I see ruin. And the one thing that I've seen from this health service is that whether you're a child, whether you're elderly, or whether you're out there working, you can't trust this health service anymore in this country. It is sick. The health service is sick in this country.
Deputy Paul Lawless.
Minister, the entire scandal in relation to the CHI has been shambolic from the outset. We have over 200 children waiting on spinal surgery. There are children waiting for scoliosis surgery in pain. Meanwhile, we have young children, as young, very young children who had surgery needlessly. This is the legacy. Children who the state has failed to treat, while we have children the state failed in terms of their treatment. It's absolutely shocking what happened. And what we have learned from the CHI whistleblower is that there was greater emphasis in protecting the system and protecting CHI than there was in terms of transparency. And that is a real shame in all of this saga. Indeed, this was like a hit and run, Minister. The CHI knew that they had done immense damage. They knew that they crashed, and yet they proceeded without even sounding the alarm. We had to wait for a whistleblower in relation to this. The action that the CHI took, particularly when they drafted the letter, Minister, and then failed to send it, is utterly deplorable. This has been a betrayal of children, a betrayal of families, and as one mother who called me stated, who am I to question the doctor? And that is the attitude. And it's a sad reality. But we have learned that actually, maybe we do need to ask questions in relation to this. We trust doctors, we trust medical professionals, and I think the saddest thing is that the parents who gave so much trust realise now that they were so mistaken. We have been also made aware, Minister, that there has been reports to us and allegations that there has been missing X-rays and missing pre-op files in relation to assessments that have actually going to now make this task around this particularly difficult, which seriously needs to be investigated. And if it is the case that those files and X-rays have gone missing purposely, I hope that the full sanctions available to you come down on those professionals. Minister, we need a broader review in relation to this. There must be a broader review and more comprehensive review, and that is the very least that the families deserve in relation to this. Thank
you, Minister and Ministers, for appearing here and making yourself available and responding to the issues and precisely outlining the measures that you've taken in response to some of the events over the last number of days. I do want to start by saying that I really think words matter, and for one of the deputies over there to tell the public in the Dáil that you cannot trust the health system, to my mind, is really inappropriate. I think it undermines and belittles thousands, tens of thousands of nurses that are going into the health service every single day, doctors that are going into the health service every day, healthcare assistants, people who are engaging in the health system. This is a very challenging time for CHI. The issues that have arisen are serious. This is a scary moment for parents who are affected and who have children who are affected. But that does not support a statement that says the entire health system in Ireland is not to be trusted. And I really do think the Deputy should consider that remark because, as I say, it's not fair, it's not supported by evidence, and it shouldn't be said in the sweeping way that it was said. Having said all of that, as I say, this is a very serious issue, and on Thursday, before the Public Accounts Committee, the current CEO appeared and acknowledged and apologised for those affected by the HICWA report, acknowledged and apologised those who are currently facing the distress of having received letters arising from the audit, and equally apologised and acknowledged to the families, I think it's 35 families who are affected by the NIGAM report. It does appear now, following the revelations of Sunday Times report, that the new CEO, who, as I say, was not the CEO at the time of when any of this happened, will have to make future apologies, or could have to make future apologies in relation to children that may not have received services to which they were entitled to in this very serious issue, which you've acknowledged, and indeed which the CEO of the HSE has acknowledged and expressed with some alarm. And it was in that background, in that context, that on Monday I wrote to the Chair of the Public Accounts Committee seeking to recall the Chief Executive of Children's Health Ireland to appear before the Public Accounts Committee at the earliest possible opportunity. It's clear that serious matters of public concern were not disclosed during the appearance of CHI before the committee last Thursday, and that the Sunday Times reports that an internal investigation conducted by the CHI in 2021 identified the misuse of the National Treatment Purchase Fund by a consultant, resulting in treatment delays of up to 3 years for children in need of urgent care. As we know, this investigation was not brought to the attention of the Department of Health or to the Public Accounts Committee or any other relevant Oireachtas committee, which, it has to be said, is a glaring failure in governance, transparency and accountability. And according to the Sunday Times reports, patients were selected by the NTPF-funded clinics not based on clinical urgency or time spent waiting, but on non-transparent criteria. Meanwhile, other children with more urgent needs were left waiting. We don't know at this moment in time who those children were, but I fear that the parents of those children, and indeed those children themselves, are also deserving of an apology, and perhaps more, depending on what all of these subsequent reviews do emerge. But as I say, further accountability is needed in the immediate term by the current CEO, who has to account essentially for things that took place not during her reign, notwithstanding the fact that the former CEO is still a strategic director within the CHI, albeit the HICWA report made clear in their findings in respect of governance that there were no specific itemised challenges made against her. But I do think, for the Public Accounts Committee's benefit, it would be helpful to have the current CEO and the former CEO, and that's certainly something that I'll be raising on Thursday's meeting.
Sinn Féin slot Deputy Rory O'Murrough.
Guramagat, Cian Corla. I think we're all very thankful to the whistleblower. It should be shocking, the report, but unfortunately it's not, that 80% of surgeries at Cappagh were not necessary and 60% not necessary at Temple Street. I think the Minister spoke about toxic behaviours within CHI. And look, we have had history in relation to issues in our healthcare system, whether we talk about Michael Neary, Michael Shine's physiotomy, and much more. So it is absolutely an absolute requirement that we deal with governance, we deal with accountability, but we also have a system that's fit for purpose, and this needs to be done as soon as possible, post-haste, and arguments will be made that an awful lot of these pieces of work possibly could have been done beforehand. But at this point in time, we are where we are. We also need to look at care in relation to those children and those parents who have been through hell. I want to talk about a constituent of mine. She has 3 children, 2 of whom have been operated on, and the 3rd is awaiting surgery. The children are now aged 5, 3 and 18 months. She has secured a review by a consultant in the north. The cost for the 3 children will be in excess of €700. She's not able to afford this. The appointment is on the 10th of June, but she's going to be like many more. Bernard Gloucester spoke about on the radio on Sunday. Those who wanted a third-party review could get one, and it would be paid for by the HSE. I suppose if we could find out what the mechanism will be in order to deliver on this, because this is obviously a requirement, and it is only right that the state would pay. And again, you're talking about a mother who's not entirely sure whether her 3rd child needs the operation, and she's not entirely sure whether the 2 daughters needed the operations that they had. Another mother has spoken to me, and this is a lady who's living in Midloud. Her child was 3, she was operated on in 2023. She now looks at the scars on her daughter and cries because she is worried that, you know, these are the marks of needless suffering. She was one of the families who received a letter earlier in the year telling her daughter that she was one of the children reviewed in the audit. She is now struggling to come to terms with what has happened and what is going to happen now. She has asked for a mechanism for getting her daughter's medical records. She has also spoken about the fact that the helpline she hasn't found entirely helpful. And she doesn't blame the people at the other end. They just don't have the information. I think she spoke earlier on News Talk in relation to this. We need to provide this. She, again, doesn't know what percentage that her daughter falls into. So we need that, and then we will need the follow-up. Minister, the issue was brought up before, obviously, of one of my constituents who, luckily enough, went for a second opinion, and his daughter is now doing gymnastics, which has not been the case.
But that is the sort of,
but we would need them to be included in a review-type process also.
Deputy Gillian Toole.
Garv maha gata ceann comhairle agus Ari go léir. In this instance, I'm not going to duplicate all of the statistics and the summaries of the review to date that members have. I suppose I'm going to approach this from the point of view of what perhaps will happen next and the human impact. And there must be a compassionate approach to supporting the children and the families through the review process without sterile communications and nor an impersonal review process. And I suppose the burning question that I would have, having worked in healthcare, is throughout all of this, what happened to first do no harm, the very foundation of the Hippocratic Oath? And if we say system, and we always say system failures and bandy it around here, but in this instance, very much in healthcare, the system is people. And they are the most valuable asset. So how do we move forward from here in terms of rebuilding trust and bringing a culture of truthfulness? So we must refer to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. A safe work environment where people are valued, where there's esteem, a sense of belonging and self-actualization. Every team member has to be valued. Ask teams for their ideas before external consultants are brought in. You'll get a better buy-in and you'll get a stronger commitment. In terms of culture, any high-performance team can question one another. The team members, that is, can question one another to get the best level of participation from each member and strive to give the best performance possible, whether that's in the workplace, in a healthcare environment, whether it's in the judicial system, whether it's here on the floor of the House. And all of that is to rebuild and to encourage truthfulness and honesty. The other area then is the area of governance. With responsibility must come accountability and openness. I have several questions in relation to the National Treatment Purchase Fund and the Treatment Abroad scheme. These, I think, at the moment are symptoms of system failure. If the costs that were ploughed into these schemes went into the public system, would we have little or any need for them? And finally, action. The recruitment of leaders, the best and most competent person for the job going forward. It may not be necessary to revert back to the HSE from CHI. Indeed, 9 years ago, CHI came from the HSE. But that the best person for the job is in the job, not just the longest serving people. Thank you, and thank you to my colleague.
The findings surrounding the use of pelvic osteotomy in children with developmental hip dysplasia raise deeply troubling concerns, not just for families directly affected, but for public confidence in paediatric care in this country. We're talking about children, vulnerable young patients whose parents entrusted the health system to do the right by them. Yet serious questions now hang over whether some of these children underwent invasive surgery unnecessary or without proper clinical justification. This is a frightening prospect, and it demands a full transparency, accountability and urgency in response. I welcome the commissioning of an independent external medical audit, but I believe that we have to go outside of the country, not to Northern Ireland, outside of the country to get true independence for a proper audit. But let me be very clear. Families deserve to know the full truth, not the sanitised summaries or indeed bureaucratic brush-offs. The audit must be thorough, independent, and in the true sense, and patients focused. Anything less would be an insult to those children who may now be living with lifelong consequences. Furthermore, lack of clear national guidelines or oversight around indicators for complex orthopaedic interventions like pelvic osteotomy is unacceptable. This is not just a clinical matter. It is a systemic governance failure that must be addressed by the HSE, the Department of Health and indeed this House. We need to listen to families, protect whistleblowers and support them even, and ensure that no child is ever again subjected to any procedure that may not be necessary. And we have to have changes. No point coming in here like we had an apology this evening and a very profound one for the Minister for Justice. Look, this is clearly unacceptable. It's scary. My late brother was a paediatrician of some renown, and I can't imagine what he'd think at what's happening today. It's just not acceptable. And GHI came from the HSE, giving it back to the HSE now. The fundamental failures there. We need true independence. Thank you.
Mr. Jennifer Carroll McNeill.
Thank you very much, Deputies, and thank you for your questions and your contributions. I will answer as many questions as I can, but also recognise that I can provide a further briefing for Deputies on a technical basis, and I'm very happy to come to the committee where we can do more back and forth. It is important that Deputies have the opportunity to contribute in this House as well, but please do, as I always try to do, let me answer as many questions as I possibly can, recognising that there's some duplication with those questions. The question of 2010 is simply the point of skeletal maturity, and that was the initial look back to account for the children who are still children. I don't think it should be necessarily cut off at that point, Deputy. I do think that we should prioritise the children first before people who are now adults. I do recognise that I have a transitional model of care for those who are in that 16, 17, 18 space moving into the adult care, but I will discuss it with the CEO of the HSE. There's no desire to exclude, there never is. In relation to the age of 7 that was brought up by 2 deputies, this was a clinical audit between the ages of 12 months and 7 years, designed to try to capture the experience between 2021 and 2023. Again, doesn't seek to exclude the other experience, but it's about a clinical audit within those parameters. So it's not limited to that. And again, I have to be really clear that it was an anonymised audit. So there's no way, and I said this on Friday, but please let me say it again. There's no way that a parent can ring up and say, "Was my child in that audit?" Because I don't know. CHI, I don't know. It by definition was an anonymised clinical audit. While we are prioritising this follow-up, and the follow-up and the care is most important, let me say 2 things. One, I completely respect that parents shouldn't have to walk into a hospital where they've had, or they feel they have had, or worry that they have had a negative experience. We do need to provide a follow-up, but there has to be a measure of flexibility in that. And I will discuss that with the HSE as well and CHI. So I do not expect parents to have to go back either to the same clinician or in the same process, but that's going to require us to have more flexibility. Deputies also referenced the impact on service delivery, which has to be taken into account. We have a finite number of healthcare professionals. We are trying to grow more. There is an interplay between these different things. The other expert review panel necessarily must be independent, external. I appreciate there's different perspectives on when I should have commissioned that, but having received the report, I think it is really important to get the recommendations and act on them as expeditiously. I appreciate there are some deputies who would have taken a different approach. That's as may be. The important thing is that it's done as quickly as possible. In relation to the letter from Cappagh, let me just say, and I've confirmed with the CEO of the HSE, that letter from Cappagh went to about 20 people. It was the same group but a different reason. It is not intended it's slightly different. The letters haven't issued yet either to Cappagh or anywhere else as I understand it. But just to be clear, those parents got a call this morning to say that they could of course bring both parents or additional guardian or whatever else. So that is something slightly different and not related to this. I do recognise the limitations with the phone line. That really was an effort to provide some answers to people over the weekend. But the people at that answering those questions, you know, they don't have any more information than I have, and it was just an initial signposting opportunity to have a clinical ear for parents at the earliest stage over the weekend rather than leave them in total silence. The questions, other questions that have been raised, the accountability and the why, so many different questions asked in relation to this. Can I just say my broad view about accountability in relation to the individual clinicians? There are really two mechanisms available for that within the employment law structure and within the professional registration regulation space. I do not have the capacity to fire a consultant in any context. Even if you think about the circumstances in relation to Limerick, where the CEO of the HSE made various steps against people working in the healthcare system, there's those issues went to a court process that is well publicised, even the taking of those different steps. I think there is an imbalance between the fair procedures that individuals have the protection of in all cases, not just in a criminal process, but in employment law processes and in other accountability processes. The balance of protection that is given to the individual and their fair procedures, which are constitutional protections, versus the balance of the broad public good and getting information out there. So many things are hampered by, not hampered by, but we have to go through fair processes, we have to behave in the correct way, and there are good reasons for that. But I do wonder about that interplay over time, and I think it's something this House should reflect on more broadly. It is the case, Deputy Rice, that explanations were advanced by surgeons which were discounted by the auditor. It is therefore the case that surgeons were contesting, at least within the audit process, the findings and advancing alternative explanations which were not stood up. I am not aware of legal proceedings, though that doesn't mean that they won't yet be taken. In relation to the trust about the running of CHI more broadly, I have said clearly, and let me say again, that this is something that I am looking at in the round, that there is a way to go on this, and I will work with deputies, particularly those on the Health Committee, in relation to this. In relation to the why, and this question has come up in a range of different ways, motive, financial, a whole range of different questions. The straight answer is that I do not know the answer to that at this point, and neither was it investigated in the clinical audit, though I do think it is an exceptionally important question, and the Taoiseach articulated it this morning. I would like to take steps to reflect on how we might get to the bottom of that, recognising that I think it's important that we also get the NIGAM report, which is linked to these different issues within orthopaedic surgery. So perhaps deputies would allow me to get that report also, and then reflect on those questions about motivation and how we might get better answers in relation to that. I am not discounting anything in relation to motivation, and I'm always very interested to hear deputies' perspectives on that. But let's perhaps get that NIGAM report and then reflect on how we would think about the mechanism for that as well. Can I say in relation to the public-private system more broadly, that, and I just want this to be completely clear, I am an advocate of public health system. If people want to have private health insurance and go to private hospitals, they are welcome to do that. This is a free country. I am a minister trying to implement a public system with no other interest in it. I am an advocate for the full implementation of the public-only consultant contract. I will be taking further steps to try to remove the perverse incentives, whatever you want to call it, that have led to that feature today because of the overhanging mix of public-private activity. You will not hear me, being dissuaded from that. It's very, very important. But it is also important that we use the levers that we have to address the waiting lists where we can, because what that means is our constituents, our people getting operations today instead of some other time while we all go on this transition together. But I am an advocate of a public health care system. There is no advantage to having insurance in the paediatric system in particular, and I do not want to see hospitals asking people, do they have insurance really ever again? It is not important or relevant in a public hospital. So just to clarify that, in case that needs clarifying. Can I just take the last 2 minutes to say that while I have tried to answer as many different questions as I can in relation to this report, I appreciate that I've come in here this evening and I've spoken now for nearly 25 minutes at the beginning and the end of the report in a very governance-focused, executive sort of way, trying to answer the questions that are rightly asked, to try to set a direction of policy change, to try to set a direction in terms of accountability. Can I take my last 2 minutes to just speak about it as a public representative, and in the same way that all of the rest of you have these very, very, very personal concerns about what has happened. Like you, I am deeply aware of the impact of surgeries being done to small children that were not warranted. I am aware of the feeling that parents will have had be hearing that a surgery was warranted and making a decision to either have that surgery or not have that surgery, as the case may be. The responsibility that parents take upon themselves to follow clinical advice and the lack of alternative information that is available to them. It's like reading Chinese on the Chinese sign being on the wall, and only the doctor can read Chinese. You have no choice in many ways but to follow the guidance. That responsibility that a clinician holds is enormous. And where that responsibility has been used in a way that is wrong is hugely problematic, but where it is used in a way that is casually wrong and has implications for the small bodies of small children is, as you have all said, unconscionable. And I want to just take that time to say that, so that my response is not one that is removed from the feeling of these things and is overly focused on the executive response that is appropriate and necessary, and it is important that you hold me accountable in relation to that. But I did just want to take that opportunity to recognise that this is something that is deeply hurtful, that has caused enormous worry to so many parents who thought that they were taking the right steps on behalf of their children in a properly governed, properly functional system with professional consultants making correct decisions. And I do just want that other perspective also to be heard very clearly. I know ministers of state have articulated it. I know the deputies on this side of the House. I know the deputies of this side of the House have articulated it. But we do that as a collective, and I just want to take the time to make sure that that is done by me also. Thank you. Yeah, I'm working on that with HSE, yeah.
Okay, thank you. That concludes statements on the independent external medical audit for Children's Health Ireland and National Orthopaedic Hospital Cappagh on indications for pelvic osteotomy in children with developmental hip dysplasias. We'll move on now to the private